Hi everyone, this is Dan, and this is my review of Thorgal Volume 0. Before we get started, I think it's important to note that this is the second video I've done in a more higher quality format. It will also be the first video where I have no cell phone footage of me or this book. My channel has mostly been cell phone style comic reviews in the same way as your boy Zach. This departure is kind of changing the channel into a video format that's more like just some guy. And I've been thinking about doing this for a while, but I never really got time to implement it till I kind of, all of this happened. And now I have some time to kind of learn a little bit about video editing and how to make higher quality content. This is a bit of an experiment, and I'd love to hear feedback from anybody in the comments as to whether they like this format more or they prefer more the amateur style that I did before. But anyhow, thank you for watching, and if you like the content, don't forget to subscribe. Thorgal is a fantasy book series written by J. Van Hamme with art by G. Rosinski. It's set in Scandinavia during the time of the Vikings and pulls out a lot from Norse mythology. The main character is Thorgal, a young man who finds himself getting screwed over by Gandalf, a Viking king. Gandalf chains Thorgal to a rock on the shore during the low tide so that he can slowly freeze to death in the cold Atlantic Ocean. His reasoning behind this is that he doesn't like Thorgal, and Thorgal is also in love with his daughter, Arisia. Just as all hope is lost, Thorgal is saved by a one-eyed woman who does so in exchange for his servitude for a year. This sets off the first book in this particular Volume 0 by Cinebook. At this point, I think it's important for me to mention that Thorgal is a BD, a shorthand for bande dessinée, a French comic book. Comics in France are very different from America in that they are almost always sold perfect bound, and they're usually in a much larger format size than the American comic book. They call it the ninth art in France, and with books like Thorgal, I can see why. Thorgal is an awesome book. The art by Rosinski is beautiful and unique. It's not quite like American comic book art, and there are small resemblances to some manga styles. Though I guess you could say, considering the age of Thorgal, you'd probably conclude that manga probably resembles Thorgal. There's a unique use of feathering here and there, but it's a lot more conservative compared to American comics. Colors are mostly flat, which is typical of comics of this age, but there's a lot of subtle use of shading and rendering with the colors here and there to break up the flats. The writing by J. Van Hamme is very solid, at least from what I read from the English translation. I'm not quite sure if the original French script is different. One thing that stands out to me in Thorgal is the almost grim fairy tale-like aspects of its stories. The book contains three stories. You could argue that all three have bittersweet and cautionary endings, almost like a fable. In particular, the ending to the last book, Island of the Frozen Seas, really struck me hard. It was a gut-wrenching ending that I feel vies with some of the best tragic stories. The second story, Almost Paradise, although a bit of a one-shot story, has a very shocking ending. And the first book, The Betrayed Sorceress, was a great opener that introduces you to the world and gives you tons of action. Reading French comics has been interesting for me. I hardly even knew of them outside of Tintin, which my mom read growing up. As I said in previous videos, I grew up with Archie comics, Sonic the Hedgehog, and later a healthy dose of manga. It is only recently, in the last several years, that I've given classic American comics a shot, and only a year ago that I picked up Blueberry as my first French BD. The French have an interesting take on the medium, and I honestly love their approach to both the art and the storytelling aspect of it. The French comic art I have seen sits in the middle between the ultra-high detail superhero comic art and the exaggerated simplistic style of shonen manga. There is a feeling of classic art and paintings that I get when I see French comics. I'm not sure if that's just the way that French artists kind of learn to do comics, or maybe it's a cultural thing. I'm not sure. I will say this, though. It's a real shame that French comics haven't caught on in America all that much. Some of them, like a Heavy Metal magazine, have a legacy, but for the most part, they're really hard to find, and for a lot of people, they're a bit obscure when you mention them. I can tell you this. If you are looking for a good fantasy book, you cannot go wrong with Thorgal. I was extremely impressed with the book, and while it wasn't my favorite fantasy comic, that will probably always be Berserk, it is absolutely worthy of your money and time to read. So, how did I do? Okay, I guess. These two panels come from page 82 of the English translated volume. It shows Thorgal reacting to the call out from an unknown adversary that has been dogging him all throughout the Island of the Frozen Seas stories. I tried to capture the seriousness of Thorgal, turning his head to this unknown enemy. My feathering is still very weak, and I have a lot to learn when it comes to inking, but at least I got the lighting correct. I may need to keep drawing much larger panels to capture some of the details I can't seem to get from the original art. This can be especially tough with European art, as the French do not have a standard artboard size like Americans and the Japanese do. In the bottom panel, I worked on two drawing techniques that I read in How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way and the DC Comics Guide to Inking. I used John Buscema's fail-proof method of drawing through the figures and ended up with some pretty decent results, particularly for the adversary here sitting on the hill with the eagles surrounding them. I think I tried to experiment with some of Klaus Janssen's advice for setting different line weights to suggest depth in the drawing. And this is with regards to the inking. And I kind of ended up with some mixed results. It kind of somewhat feels like the mountains and the hills in the background are distant, but I think I need more variance in my line weights in order to really get that to pop more appropriately. Anyhow, that's the video. Let me know what you think. If you like the video, please hit the thumbs up to like it. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Hit the bell for notifications. If you have any comments on Thorgal, this review, or my art, please leave it down below, and I will see you next time.